Emily opened the door and entered the apartment. Her heart was racing and her legs were giving way. Leaning against the wall, she slowly slid down and covered her face with her hands. Then she heard an elderly voice from the living room. "Granddaughter, is that you? Why don't you come in?" Emily took off her shoes, hung up her jacket, and wiping away her tears, appeared before her grandfather. "Hi, Grandpa. I just couldn't get the button undone, that's why it took me so long." John looked at her, then ran the back of his hand over his face and said, "You've been crying again. I can't be fooled, old as I am. And why bother when I know everything anyway? Your relatives have been pestering you again, haven't they? Just please tell me the truth." Emily cautiously nodded and replied, "You're right, Grandpa. They give me no peace. They still think I've got my eye on your apartment. That's why I supposedly come to see you all the time, so you rewrite your will in my name. But I don't want anything." The granddaughter almost burst into tears again, but her grandfather calmed her down in time. "Don't pay any attention. It will all be over soon. I can feel that I don't have long left. I'm slowly getting ready. And why are you looking at me like that in surprise? The final journey is the most important one. Surely I won't embark on it empty-handed." "Okay, we seniors are just joking here. But seriously, the other day I went to the funeral home and barely made it there. We discussed getting a gravestone and I placed an advance order. I don't want it to be made of stone. I asked for a metal one shaped like a little house." With a slight smile, Emily said, "You talk as if you'll be gone tomorrow. The doctors told you only 2 weeks ago you've still got at least 5 years to live." In response, John sighed deeply and said, "Well, that was then. Doctors change their diagnoses daily, if not by the minute like weather forecasters do." The granddaughter and grandfather laughed, but at that very moment, Emily intuitively felt that he wasn't joking. On the table, there really was a receipt for payment to the funeral home. Emily picked up the piece of paper, read it, and then looked at her grandfather. Her heart tightened, and there was a lump in her throat. She realized that her beloved grandfather was tired not because of his age, but because he was no longer welcome here, except for her. As mentioned above, the relatives not only gave Emily no peace, but they also kept calling and hinting that she didn't belong there. Supposedly, that was the only reason she visited her grandfather so often, so he would rewrite his will in her favor. Strange to see how willing relatives were to throw mud at each other to satisfy their mercenary interests. The granddaughter wasn't claiming anything and immediately told her grandfather not to put her in his will. John hugged Emily tightly and said, "Everything will be as it should." After making him something to eat, Emily gathered her things to leave. But in the hallway, she stopped. "Grandpa, I haven't told you the main thing. I've got a boyfriend. We've only been seeing each other for a couple of weeks, but I feel like Brian has serious intentions towards me. Here, take a look at him." The grandfather slowly got up and glanced at Brian's picture on Emily's phone. After a couple of seconds, he stroked his granddaughter's hair and replied, "You can tell right away he's a fine young man. If only God would grant me the time to celebrate your wedding." Emily wished her grandfather all the best and left the apartment. 3 days later, John passed away. That day he went for his usual daytime stroll as always, but when he started heading home, he suddenly fell. This was witnessed by a neighbor who called the paramedics. They arrived within minutes and pronounced him dead. The grandfather's heart had stopped beating forever. Immediately after that, the relatives suddenly became more active. What happened in those days could safely be called a nightmare. They didn't mince words trying to snatch their piece of inheritance from one another. And all this while John hadn't even been buried yet, and no one knew what was specified in the will. Emily watched this circus from the sidelines, bitterly grieving. She managed to bring the relatives to their senses and persuaded them to arrange the burial first before dividing the grandfather's property. Everything was done in just 3 days, and the closest people gathered at the cemetery to see John off on his final journey. One of the relatives said, "That's how it goes in life. Someone lived and now he's gone." We all know Uncle John was a jewelry expert who could live high on the hog but chose a modest and measured life instead. He departed with restraint and without pomp, as befits people of our stock. These words were spoken by John's niece, and almost all the relatives nodded in agreement. But only Emily understood what that concealed. The relatives were simply shirking responsibility, pretending they had nothing to do with it. Supposedly, they sincerely loved their uncle, and then immediately admired how modestly he had lived. It was all bluff and deceit. Outsiders might believe it, but not the only granddaughter who took care of him to his dying day. The notary turned out to be a close acquaintance of one of the relatives, and he privately told them that the granddaughter wouldn't inherit anything of significant value. Good money was paid for such information, but it was the pretext for mockery. Almost all the relatives unanimously sneered, "Well, Emily, did you want Easy Street for free? Keep dreaming. Even your beloved grandfather barely opened his purse for you. Serves you right, failure." As is customary, after some time all the heirs were officially invited to the notary's office. You could tell from the faces of the relatives that they were looking forward to a generous will. Even considering John hadn't lived lavishly, an apartment in the city center remained after him. Not only that, there was also a garage with a car, albeit a domestic model, plus some savings in a bank account. All these immense riches, in quotation marks, went to the closest relatives. As for the granddaughter, all she inherited was an old cottage in the village. They looked at her as if she was an outsider. "Be happy you got any part of the inheritance at all. If I were your grandfather, I would have kicked you out before it was too late." Swallowing the insult, Emily went outside. After walking a little way, she squatted down and cried bitterly. 6 months have passed since then, and Emily was the lawful owner of that very house on every ground. During this time, her relationship with Brian grew from innocent dates to the prospect of living together. In other words, the young people wanted to become a family. Not hard to guess that at that point, they didn't have a place of their own. Emily's parents divorced about 6 years ago and split the apartment. As a result, she wasn't expecting to get her own living space anytime soon. Brian's situation wasn't any better. A former orphanage pupil, he'd been given a little room in a dormitory. Of course, you can't start a family there, no matter how hard you try. So Emily suggested going to the village and fixing up her grandfather's cottage. The future was foggy for now, but the girl assured her boyfriend that hardships are easier to overcome together. Before going to the village, Emily visited her grandfather's grave. Brian offered to go with her. "Even though I never talked to him, from what you've told me, your grandfather loved you very much. It's just strange how the relatives ganged up on you like that. Can money be the most important thing for them? Of course, I've got nothing to brag about, but at the orphanage, we always had each other's backs." Emily understood where he was leading but didn't want to split hairs. After all, you can't change her relatives, and Brian's words are wasted on them. At the grave, her boyfriend noticed an interesting headstone. "Did you order this yourself?" "I've seen graves, but they usually just have crosses or marble granite." Emily replied that her grandfather had chosen it himself. Imagine, shortly before his death, Grandpa went to the funeral home and ordered the headstone himself. I even held the receipt in my hands. I was so offended for him then. Words can't describe it. He wasn't getting ready to die from old age, but because, except for me, he was no longer welcome here. Brian looked at Emily in surprise and asked, "What do you mean?" She replied, "You don't need to understand that, Brian. I wouldn't wish it on my enemy to be elderly with such worthless relatives around." 2 hours later, they arrived at the village, and the first thing they did was let a cat into the house. Emily had bought it, especially at the market. Amazingly, the cat ran to the middle of the room and looked around cautiously. then rubbed against the legs of the future owners and purred affectionately. Looking at each other, Brian and Emily said in unison, "This house has accepted us." The house did indeed require repairs, but that didn't scare the young people. They were planning to settle in the village permanently, so as not to depend on anyone. And it would keep them away from Grandpa's relatives, too. After all, they had become so obsessed with the inheritance that it was tearing them apart. Rumor had it they were already trying to sell the apartment to pocket the last of Grandpa's possessions. As for the car and savings, nothing was left of that property. Emily examined the inside of the house and said, "They were right about Grandpa. He loved antiques. Just look, Brian, at how beautifully everything is done. It's like going back 100 years. Her boyfriend nodded in response. "That's true. It does feel that way, and I suggest we leave some of this interior as it is. Of course, we'll renovate, but we won't touch the spirit of antiquity." Emily agreed with him. "You're right. Let there be at least some reminder left. By the way, the cemetery isn't that far from the village. I can visit Grandpa more often." Interestingly, after the funeral, the relatives forgot how to get to John, and they didn't have time for him because they were still fighting over Grandpa's inheritable apartment. One day, Emily came to town and accidentally ran into that very niece who had given the fiery speech at her grandfather's grave. Karen looked at her and smirked mockingly. "Well, tell me how's life in your new place. Maybe you need help with firewood? We've still got a lot of useless furniture left in Grandpa's apartment after he died. Feel free to stop by for some kindling tomorrow." It was unbearable to listen to, and Emily flared up. "Have you lost your mind, Aunt Karen? Don't think there's a demon inside you. I'll fix up that house and soon you'll be the one envying me." Saying goodbye, Emily finished her errands and returned to the village. She didn't tell her boyfriend about meeting her aunt. However, that night she dreamed of her grandfather. He just silently looked into her eyes and cried. In the dream, Emily bawled with him, and suddenly he said unexpectedly, "Thank you, granddaughter, for burying me properly. But I'm bored all alone. Come visit my grave." The girl didn't believe in prophetic dreams, but the next morning went to the cemetery anyway. She brought flowers and put them on the grave. Glancing at the tombstone, Emily noticed that the ceramic photo was somehow crookedly positioned. They hadn't paid attention to this after the installation, but now it caught the eye. The granddaughter came closer, and only then realized that Grandpa's picture had been attached askew. Not wanting to yell at the funeral home representatives, Emily decided to go back home and ask Brian to help fix everything. When she explained to her boyfriend what she needed from him, Brian took all the necessary tools, and together they went to the cemetery. The photo was slightly shifted to the right, so to straighten it out, they first had to remove it and then drill new holes. Brian did just that, but behind the picture, they discovered a keyhole. Looking closely, Emily and her boyfriend guessed it was a hiding place. Brian was holding the ceramic plaque. He turned it around and found a small key attached. Using it, they opened the secret compartment. Someone had specially made a small recess with a stand inside. Brian pulled out several old photographs and a note. Emily looked at these things and said, "Let's go home. We'll read it there." An hour later, they were sitting in the kitchen going through the old pictures. They showed Grandpa in his youth. He was captured at work. It was interesting to watch him working on a piece of jewelry. Putting the photos aside, Emily unfolded the note. "Dear Emily, if you're reading this, then I am no longer alive. I foresaw that after my death, there would be an outright war over the inheritance. Forgive me for leaving you only this rickety house in the village, but it's not as ordinary as it first appears." Emily looked at Brian, sighed heavily, and continued, "Here's the thing, granddaughter. I spent my whole conscious life working as a jeweler. I told you long ago what kind of profession it is and what blessings it bestows, but I didn't take advantage of them, in the sense that I lived moderately and didn't strive for ostentatious luxury. In that house where you, I hope, have already moved in." There is another hiding place. When you find it, please use it wisely. I remember shortly before my death you told me about Brian. I wish you happiness and love. Marry him. I feel he's the man who will be your support." At the end of the message, there was a small map showing where to look for the hiding place. Brian and Emily went down to the basement with a flashlight, and 20 minutes later pulled a heavy metal box to the surface. From the sound, you could tell there were some iron things inside. There was no secret to the lock, and it opened with a simple screwdriver. The contents of the box dazzled. There were gold rings and signet rings, a gold monocle, and watches, several from different manufacturers. Particularly memorable was the thick gold bracelet, and there was also a precious cross, although Grandpa had never worn it. What John did for a living explained where all the jewelry and decorations came from. By modest estimates, the box contained items worth several kilograms. A couple weeks after the discovery, Brian and Emily started renovating the house while the granddaughter changed her grandfather's fence at the grave, put it in order, and arranged with the cemetery workers to keep the burial place clean. In addition, Emily insisted on buying a car because the city was far away. Her boyfriend had a driver's license, but Emily decided to get one too. She took driving lessons, and soon the young couple went to town in that car together. When the relatives saw her behind the wheel of an expensive vehicle, they were simply stunned. They couldn't believe the poor granddaughter suddenly had big money. Looking at the relatives, Brian loudly announced, "We will get married soon. The wedding will be in the village. The villagers have welcomed us. They are invited. And we don't want to see you there. Keep squabbling over the inheritance." A month later, the young people officially registered their relationship. The contents of the little box will last them a long time. However you look at it, Grandpa left his beloved granddaughter not just an old house, but a trunk with a false bottom. Subscribe to our channel and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one.